Okay, we have 14 comments or things to add to our, we just doubled the length of your book, Michael. We started with assessments, which is a nice lead off from the last group, and just underscored the importance of thinking about a hybrid court as not a cookie-cutter solution, but it has to, of course, be grounded in an assessment that the national courts have neither the capacity nor maybe the credibility to counter the criminalized power structure, that somehow the criminalized power structure has compromised the national courts, and that was when you would turn to a hybrid court. Also important to appreciate what special court may mean in the domestic context, such as in post-Saddam Hussein's Iraq, where special court was associated with one of Saddam's courts, and not to stumble into that. Second, our group felt it was important to clarify that this idea does not necessarily contemplate an executive mandate, that the hybrid court is agreed, would be agreed typically with the national authorities embedded in a national system, but that agreement with the national authority would give a very limited executive enforcement authority to a prosecutor and to the police for this purpose. We had a good discussion about the fact that the book should address who decides who gets prosecuted. And we haven't really spelled that out in the current draft, where and it could, of course, be the mission leadership that gets to ultimately decide, or you could have an independent prosecutor who gets to decide. You won't be surprised that our group, led by an international prosecutor, thought the prosecutor should get to decide. And we generally thought that that was more consistent and a better response to the more consistent with the rule of law. On the other hand, if the mission leadership gets to decide, they maybe are in a position to mediate some peace versus justice issues. We had a comment on intelligence-led policing, and just want to make sure that that includes the prosecutor, that the prosecutor is a part of that unit that has access to the intelligence, and that the prosecutor has security clearance to have access to that intelligence as a basis for evidence. We had a good discussion about the purpose of these courts and the substantive jurisdiction, and emphasized the fact this is not just a retrospective war crimes, crimes against humanity kind of process, but importantly, especially for looking at criminalized power structures and countering them, it should be prospective and have jurisdiction over serious crimes that would affect the peace, such as corruption, trafficking in weapons, political violence, and the like. We had a good discussion about the relationship between the hybrid court to the national system, emphasizing, of course, that this is embedded in the national system, but that the prosecutor would have the power to take cases from domestic courts, including then the power to dismiss cases that the domestic courts might be initiating for political reasons. Small but important kind of technical point, the current draft refers to specialized court. It should be special court. And what that connotes is that a specialized court would be within the national system with a appellate recourse within that national structure. And it's important that the special court, though embedded in the national system, has its own independent appellate structure. We thought that it might be interesting to think about a mechanism whereby the special court could hand cases back to the national courts, and particularly to think about phasing out the special court. And we think that perhaps we need to develop more in our draft the benchmarking process for when that jurisdiction can be handed back to the national courts. We think we need to address incarceration and prison capacity and oversight of incarceration for those convicted by the special court, and think perhaps that would best sit with a judge who is in charge of sentencing, that they would be able to adjudicate the conditions of detention, that would take into consideration the ongoing threat to the peace. We wouldn't want the criminal power structure to thrive in the prisons, for example. Importance of communication strategy for the special court and transparency in explaining what it does and its jurisdiction to the public and to other legal structures in the country. One small, but I think important technical point on page 5, where we talk about the enabling legal framework. We were not so keen on the language and the admonition not to romanticize national law. We actually think it's important in creating a special court that we start with the national law. That's important for its legitimacy nationally. And then, of course, we will, the special court would have amended jurisdiction as appropriate if the national law wasn't up to international standards or didn't give the prosecutor the tools that he or she needed. We talked about whether this could be accompanied with a truth and reconciliation process. We thought that might work in some contexts, might be important in some contexts, and we might want to address that in the book. In talking about the enabling legal framework, we want to emphasize the importance of equality of arms. And right now, the discussion of enabling legal framework talks a lot about tools in the prosecutor's toolbox, but we want to also make sure that we underscore the importance of defendant rights, in particular the right to defense counsel and the right to disclosure of exculpatory evidence. And finally, our group had a good discussion about this being part of a holistic approach to criminalized power structures. And while it makes sense, of course, to think about a criminal jurisdiction to respond to criminalized power structures, we also felt that it's important that there be a holistic rule of law strategy that includes addressing issues like commercial law, family law, and addresses issues of sequencing of those different reforms, because and that those other reforms are an important part of the response to the criminalized power structure as well. As Professor Stedman mentioned this morning, of course, the overall economic context is a factor here, and the broader rule of law affects that. So I think that was it. Gang, if I left anything out, I'm sure you will chime in.
Betsy, terrific and on time. And I realize that while all of you have the agenda and you know who the moderator is, for the person who's watching on the webinar, I'm Bill Durch from the Stimson Center in Washington. The third speaker is, yeah. Yeah, okay. Dave Beer on integrating criminal intelligence-led policing.
A couple of comments to thank you all for participating. It's been a real pleasure for me, and I hope that we've got something tangible and worthwhile that will take its place in the history of peacekeeping operations at some point in time. A couple of overriding issues here that I'd like to touch on to put into context some of the specific amendments or suggested amendments we made to the recommendations. One is the sensitivity to the language, understanding that the whole notion of intelligence, and particularly dealing with the international community and our brothers and sisters and colleagues at the UN, dealing with the word intelligence has all sorts of implications. So as we word these recommendations, we are very sensitive to the whole notion of intelligence, be it criminal intelligence or otherwise. Oversight of any activities that get suggested in the context of intelligence, I think will be important. And we were also concerned that whatever gets recommended at the level of intelligence-led policing operations gets considered in the context of planning. That would be for the attention of those people that were dealing with planning issues and the recommendations. And just the general observation here, and I think it puts into context some of the things that we will raise, is that the UN, by virtue of having created an environment where joint mission analysis centers can and do operate, has already accepted the notion of intelligence at the strategic level and how that supports the mission and the mission mandate and protects civilians and all of those good things that it's intended to do. And by virtue of that, we're only one short step away of getting them to understand more concretely the notion of tactical intelligence and indeed criminal intelligence-led policing. Just a general comment there. Also, we thought that in terms of the recommendations, and I'll go through these very quickly bullet by bullet in a second, but the standing police capacity can be of a great benefit to us in instituting the recommendations specifically related to intelligence-led policing and more particularly about developing the capacity within the UN and within member states and contributing police countries. And also that we take advantage of the current structure of police division and the current initiative of the strategic guidance framework and the experts group that is driving and assisting to steer the strategic governance framework, or strategic governance framework group of policing division of DPKO. This is an initiative that's ongoing in order to redefine and refine and improve the police, the delivery of police and security services by police division. So now, there were 5 recommendations related to intelligence-led policing. The first one, with respect to embracing the concept of intelligence-led policing as a legal, accountable, and transparent operational methodology. We accepted that essentially carte blanche, but wanted it noted at some point that this should be part and parcel of the mission planning process so that it takes into consideration the broader environment, the broader security environment, political environment, and all aspects of the conflict or post-conflict situation that the mission was going to be mandated to address. Also that it be noted that this be done on a mission-by-mission basis, that it actually be defined what sort of mission criminal intelligence policing requirements were likely to be required of that mission. And it goes back to the notion of mission planning, but it also addresses the idea of having a softer language and recognizing that development missions are different than executive Part 7 missions, and that there are different security requirements and different requirements for the UN generally or the international community to be more or less aggressive in terms of how they do their policing activities. And this goes back to the notion of, again, executive or support missions. Finally, in terms of the first recommendation, we thought that, again, and this refers back to the language and softening the language, we talked about criminal intelligence methods as opposed to the general notion of methodology. So that in stipulating on a mission-by-mission basis what it was likely to require in terms of support to that particular mission, methods provided an opportunity for a broader range of language that might be more acceptable to the international community. Now, the second recommendation, DPKO should develop a cadre of intelligence professionals. Again, the language needs to be softened there, and minimally that should read criminal intelligence professionals, so as not to scare away people that might be concerned with the broad notion of intelligence and what that means historically and in peace missions and conflict environments. Again, the JMAC, by virtue of being an acceptable practice in terms of how it supports the mission, is already a strategic intelligence capacity for that mission. And it may be worthwhile to reinforce that in one of these bullets, that the criminal intelligence component is simply a tactical extension of that mission, albeit and focused on the security of the mission and the mission, different components of the mission mandate, but also the security of mission personnel. internal oversight. I go right down to the third bullet now. DPKO should develop an internal system of internal oversight. This goes hand in hand with the reviews of the last recommendations. This may be something that could be actually passed off to the experts group of the Strategic Guidance Framework to wrestle with just exactly what an oversight committee would look like. Who would they report to, and what sort of structure would be would make the international community more comfortable with the notion of criminal intelligence-led policing operations and all of that means. Because from a practical perspective, whether we're talking about open source information or human intelligence or technical intelligence, there may be a wide range of methods required for a particular mission, but with a proper accountability framework, some of the more sensitive ones may be acceptable. Finally, I think on the last bullet, we were unanimous in our agreement to extract all of the wordage that lists intelligence agencies or enforcement agencies that would receive information, and that would include, in this particular example, the American agencies that are listed under the bullet, in favor of a mission-by-mission accountability and partnership of the mission and the security apparatus within the mission, recognizing that any particular conflict or post-conflict environment has regional issues, and the police that either have executive authority or support authority for that particular mission will have responsibilities to policing or enforcement organizations in other countries that border in that particular region. That's a given within some of the new language and work of the Strategic Guidance Framework of DPKO. So they'll be sensitive to that. So on a mission-by-mission basis, it could be actually stipulated where it would be expected information could be and would be shared by the police component in the context of intelligence-led policing. And finally, in support to our missing colleague, General Inch, who had to go away, we wanted to, in a general way, and this may be placement in another category, Mike, was to draw attention to the fact that the international community has never made full value of military police officers as police officers, as opposed to soldiers. And from my own experience in Iraq, I can attest to that. But it may well be that the military police officer is an interesting bridge between the gaps of the military component and the police component that still exist in any international mission. So quickly, I got two colleagues. Anything I missed? No? Thank you both very much. Thanks.
Okay. I'd like to turn the floor over to Julie Werbel from Accountability and Making It a Priority Equal to Capacity Building. Julie.
Okay, so a lot of what we're going to say builds on some of the findings from the previous groups. But first of all, we felt that the recommendations as they were stated assumed off the bat that the state was a bad apple, and that in fact interventions would be based on the assessment of the state and the degree to which it had been, individuals had been corrupted or co-opted, or to the degree of state capture. So the focus on civil society might be most appropriate when there was complete state capture, but in a place where, say, border guards had been corrupted by criminal elements, that might call for a different set of interventions. So we would like to propose, as a way of ordering this section, kind of 3 lines of accountability, or 3 baskets. The first being the international donor community and our comportment of our own personnel and management of our own resources and the impact that that has on our ability to address crime. The second basket being sort of the wider rule of law governance system in place, and it's what I think you call the prevailing accountability regime. And the third category being the security sector itself and the way in which we undertake security sector reform or rebuilding of the security and intelligence services. So in the first category, that's the international donors or the do no harm category, we identified a number of points that in many ways encapsulate what you had as original recommendations. The first being lead by example, that our behavior shapes the narrative. So in particular, that means keeping in mind key principles, including civilian primacy and the impact that has on the way that we deliver our assistance. Recognize that our decisions and actions have consequences. Where we purchase goods and services, for example, needs to be diversified to ensure that we are not patronizing the very same networks that we are trying to dismantle. We also need to take to pay attention to the personal comportment of all of our staff, and I will come back to that, and the distortionary impact of our funding. And that leads to a second point about designing strategies and that enable flexibility and adaptability and conditionality so that we can reward accountability and transparency and register our disappointment where it's not present. And that in some ways means that both the UN and the bilateral donors have to increase our level of comfort with accepting short-term project failure in exchange for long-term mission success. And that's particularly important around the issue of criminal networks, because you don't always know when you start off a project the degree to which it is infiltrated. The points on metrics we felt need to be tied to program design and strategy, that they're not metrics for their own sake, but we need to be clear about what it is we are measuring. And in this case, it comes down to where our money is going and what we had intended to achieve. At the moment, our metrics are atomized across donors. We have metrics and evaluations for our individual projects, but not collectively, and it's extremely difficult to think across the table. We also need internal structures in place to prevent abuses of our own staff or the misuse of funds. And these, in many ways, are the same kinds of accountability structures that we would propose for the state itself. That would be line management. That would be internal affairs and the ability to conduct investigations. We had a fair bit of conversation about the hybrid court, in particular as a tool as proposed in here to address that, and we felt that that would make it particularly difficult for troop contributing countries who at the moment retain the ability and the authority to handle cases affecting their own personnel. And then ultimately, again, at the international donor level, we may need to do a fundamental rethink of overall business processes so that transnational organized crime, illicit power structures, so that we are collectively able to address these as a primary target. And that means things like revisiting the 6-month mandate, because as we know, spoilers can outlast us. With respect to the second bucket would be overall rule of law and governance. The first thing, and again it's related to the first, is affording rule of law primacy in the mandate. And this speaks to our interventions with respect to policing in the immediate term might save the leg, but might still kill the patient. So we need to really push rule of law much more so than has been done before. A second point there is that we need to take granular solutions to some of these legal problems. Don't necessarily start with the Supreme Court or the high end, but start from the bottom up, where we know we have experience with success. And that speaks to the conversation of going after the big fish and the hybrid courts, or whether you go go smaller from the bottom up. I think I mentioned this, but the recommendations are really largely missing the government, and that there are levels of accountability we would expect within the government at the national level, at the regional level, at the municipal level, that should be in place as part of the response. In many countries, mayors, for example, have a particularly important role to play. I would add to that the same structures that we would want in place within our own, in terms of accountability systems within our own structures. We would want vertical, horizontal, diagonal, judicial accountability, political accountability, putting in place an overall framework or pattern of accountability that would help us respond to some of the flagrant abuses. Okay. This speaks to another point that I made in the first bucket, was dividing projects into more flexible and adaptable projects, meaning that would enable the kind of community-based monitoring that you suggested in the recommendations, but that unless it's brought down to the local level, it's very difficult for these organizations to play an effective monitoring role. You can't at the community level monitor resources or projects that are conducted at the national level. And then finally on this, 2 more points on this bucket would be to be sure to recognize that there are different approaches to justice within the operating environment, that there will be transitional justice, traditional justice or customary justice that needs to be taken into account when coming up with responses to criminal behavior, and that building an overall culture of lawfulness will be particularly important, starting even in terms of incorporating rule of law into the service delivery around other elements, so that you don't pay, it's wrong to pay a bribe at the doctor. So when you start to acknowledge criminal behavior and corrupt behavior in one sector, it can start to build this culture of lawfulness. And finally, when we're displacing criminal elements, we are creating a vacuum. So we want to make sure that that vacuum is either filled by the government where they're capable, or if there's a substitution in place, that there's a transition plan so that the UN or other donors can turn it over. With respect to the final line of effort, the security sector reform, or the reform of the security sector and the intelligence services, one key piece that was missing is vetting and lustration, which is critical for accountability systems. And then again, the focus on institutional development is listed. This sort of rebalancing of institutional engagement is described as listed but not described. So putting in place the systems and processes that would enable accountability. And again, that's the horizontal and vertical, but it's more specifically line management, internal affairs, oversight bodies, community boards. And we noted that where you have international oversight, it could just as easily be external oversight. It doesn't necessarily need to be international. And then finally, with respect to the point on intelligence reform, there are a lot of pieces in this bullet that really need to be disaggregated. There's already a disconnect between DDR as it's written in mandates and the circumstances on the ground. We've clearly reached a 3rd generation of DDR, and that is particularly important as we deal with CVE and violent extremism, but it's equally important with respect to transnational organized crime. And I don't think we've gotten there yet. So matching that DDR to the intelligence, state intelligence, may be an additional disconnect. And then when you think about DDR, there are really 3 paths an individual can take: reintegration into society, some sort of transitional justice, or integration into some sort of security forces, and that's where the vetting and lustration makes it becomes truly imperative. And then we had a similar conversation about actually whether the intelligence services in many of these countries were needed, and here we're talking about national intelligence as opposed to police intelligence, and that there could be some sort of shifting of emphasis that the UN may be in a position to encourage at the beginning in that golden hour, which we concluded there was, to really focus on police intelligence and perhaps even the dismantling of national intelligence, although intelligence services are a lot like militaries. Governments like to keep them. And I think
Thank you very much, Julie. And so for severing the flow of illicit revenue, Kristi Clough. Here we go.
So we dealt with about 9 different recommendations, and we had a lot of good discussions on them throughout the time, and ended up finding that some of them cut across some similar themes. So rather than go through it recommendation by recommendation, I'll be going through it in theme, and I'll let you know which of the recommendations that seem to cover. So for the first recommendation that looks at USA Patriot Act, especially Section 311, as a potential tool to address the shadow financial system and also the legitimate financial system that is facilitating some of these flows. We did agree that this is potentially a good mechanism, and indeed it was very useful when the Patriot Act was first coming into practice, and we were able to essentially do away with shell banks by preventing any kind of U.S. financial institution from handling money that had ever touched a shell bank, and that included correspondent accounts, which is when you just kind of briefly touch U.S. shores just to be able to transfer from point A to point C, and you have this little bit of a B. But one thing we need to remember with that is it's only one tool, and this is a global problem. It is a global shadow financial system, not just a U.S. one. So we need to make sure that all partners, especially other major financial centers, are partnering with us to also deal with their dimensions of it. And in addition to kind of global and international actors, making sure that we are working with the national government in question to see what kind of tools they want and giving them a role to play, even though obviously there are some separate roles through what is happening in the financial system that is outside their pure jurisdiction, but not separating it too much just into the Patriot Act and the U.S. government. In terms of kind of the next in particular, 2 recommendations that looked at an expert panel and the overall mission. We think it's really important to have an understanding of what the local dynamics are that are at play. Who are the actors? How might they be related? How are they operating? How are they financing themselves? And so really getting a good map of that terrain and what's going on so you understand it and understand the interplay. Need to understand kind of the potential risks of different actions, especially if you want to do any kind of naming and shaming, which is one of the possibilities. What's the correlate, what's the follow-on, what might happen, and doing a cost-benefit analysis of that. So, from a pure justice perspective, maybe you want to name and shame, but at least at that particular moment or in the short run, are the costs of that naming and shaming too much depending on the role that particular company or group or individual might be playing. Don't lose sight of that forever, but think about that in the short term. And then also thinking about unintended consequences, especially potential blowback if you're successful. So we talked about examples in areas where, we were maybe able to dismantle gangs or an illicit criminalized group, and then when you got rid of all the money that was flowing through that community, you suddenly had a major economic crisis in that community on your hand, because you had people who were, supplying goods to the employees of that criminal structure and all that goes along with that, which isn't a reason not to take that action. It's very important still to take, but we need to be ready for the downside of our success and have a plan to help those communities move forward and help kind of provide a bridge and make sure they don't fall apart, and then we end up creating a lot of resentment and an environment where something else can take root down the road. Also in this area, it's really important to make use of NGOs, local NGOs, but also international NGOs. The international NGOs might play an even bigger role at the very beginnings when perhaps you might be operating in an environment that doesn't have a strong local network of NGOs and civil society organizations who can help share information, who can help do investigations of who's really acting, what's really going on with development projects, with power structures, and because there's more of a security concern for the local organizations, whereas somebody based in a foreign country, even if they're, they might be using some local data collectors, but they don't have that same personal security risk. But in the end, you want to build that local capacity. You want to use the local NGOs as much as possible, and they're going to be your best source of information to do that analysis, to understand who the actors are and who's related to whom, and what will happen if you target point A. You might not have realized what's going to happen, 5 points down the line unless you talk to them. But we have to keep in mind this is very case by case. So you can be successful in one country with targeting NGOs in a certain way, and you can't necessarily replicate that in every single country in a cookie cutter method. So have that outlook on NGOs, but expect that you're going to have to do all the work pretty much every single time. And even within a country, if you're having some success with one group or one type of plan, you can't necessarily successfully scale that up. So don't assume that you can. Look into what the possibilities are and see how it goes. So use this tool, but remember that there are some limitations, and you have to be very, very specific in how you use it. Another thing that's really important in an area where the international mission can really help support the work of NGOs, local and international, is pushing transparency. Transparency of contracts, transparency of budgets, transparency of who within a banking system owns and controls accounts, not just the name of yet another corporation or some kind of fake nominee director, but the actual beneficial owner. And if you don't have that kind of information, you as a government aren't going to get very far, and civil society isn't going to get very far. So really think about that, especially since civil society can play the role of putting out information that you as, somebody part of the mission or part of an international government can't do for diplomatic and political reasons. But once that information is out there, you're going to be able to leverage that and build some more political will behind it. So there's a lot of good potential for cooperation, so make sure to tap into that. And there were several that covered some things that really went well together, which would be sanctions regimes, Dodd-Frank legislation and similar, supply chain targets, and customs reforms. I'm going to deal with those in a couple that merge together with that. So one thing is to make sure to look at existing bodies and regimes and agreements that have already been negotiated and people are already engaged in, without necessarily having to reinvent the wheel and go through all these negotiations all over again every time. One thing we weren't sure, we didn't see mentioned in the recommendation language here, and we're not sure if it's in the broader text, is something. For one example is the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, which deals with money laundering and CFT. They have a lot of mechanisms in place already that states have bought into. Maybe there's something there, maybe there's something missing, and we can talk about adding to that, but it may just be a matter of leveraging what already exists. OECD due diligence is another example, and the UN Convention Against Corruption. There are things in here that need to be strengthened. They're not being talked about and used as much as they could be, and this could be an example for moving those along. Yes, you need to understand the supply chain, and that's part of that initial analysis to, where are minerals and other resources being extracted from, what kind of extraction is required in that, what's the role groups are playing in there, how are they moving those resources out, what are the road networks like, what are the ports that might be involved. So that's very, very critical, and it can be an area where once you know what that map is, you can start figuring out what's the best way to target that and curtail it and monitor it, and you'll be able to get some good return on that investment. And in terms of customs are really, really critical. And it's in that country where you're operating the mission, but also the neighboring countries where some of these resources are going to go if you've got some sanctions in place in one country and some additional monitoring. So you can help train them. You can help share information for them to be able to look out for some warning signs of what might be some smuggling. And also just making sure they understand what laws and what mechanisms are already in place that they could be using to check some of these transactions, or if they know a transaction is bad but they think they don't have a legal way of stopping it, there's probably something out there that you can tell them, no, yes, you do have the power to stop this transaction from going across the border. Here's how. Long term, there's a lot more you can do long term, and be mindful of that, but avoid getting too sophisticated and too technical, especially with electronic systems in the beginning, because that's That's just not feasible. The final one we dealt with was GMAP, the Governance and Economic Management Assistance Program, which, I guess it's debatable whether or not that was successful in Liberia, but it was something that was applied to Liberia. We didn't think that that was something that could really be replicated, because the type, to have an international body able to play that kind of role with a country's sovereignty, probably just not going to happen again, and we shouldn't invest too much time in understanding how to replicate that specifically, but instead we could look at what were some of the dynamics of it that were so successful. And one thing we identified was the fact that you had international experts embedded in the country, helping people along, building that local capacity, helping them execute their responsibilities, and then they get a better sense of how the dynamics in the country really work, as opposed to just being there from the outside and having not enough information to really do their job, as well as they could be. But that, again, that local capacity building is certainly really important. So emphasize that, but that the program overall probably isn't going to be relevant. And then we also just noticed that it's probably going to be a very long glossary to this document, because we had so much alphabet soup just in our one discussion. I'm sure there are plenty of others who've already heard that, because there were some of us who weren't as familiar with GMAP, for example, so that was how that came up. But overall, really important issue area, and a lot of good stuff. Thank you.
Much. I feel an urge to surge on the part of foreign police units. So who's speaking to? Okay. Giorgio. Thank you very much. We'll run to start this discussion.
Yes, I will. Okay, our group, and I'm really thankful to all the members of the group, and I apologize if I miss something. Some recommendation, please. I ask members of the group to intervene just to fill the gap. And just about filling the gap were the main topics of our discussion. Mainly, we talk about the deployment gap, what we can do to reduce the deployment gap to meet the mission's requirement, and then also the operational gap, how FPUs can better support the police component in addressing the different security challenges. Actually, we focus more on the first recommendation, and we didn't have so much time to discuss the second one. Regarding the first one, we had a lot of discussion on the equipment. There was a recommendation saying that the US should provide, should donate the excess defense articles to the UN for further deployment to certain missions. We said that first it's better to consider the donation to certain member states that can be deployed to the field missions. Then it was said that the donation of these excess defense articles could not be advisable, because this equipment is already almost at the end of the life cycle, so this could be a matter of concern if deployed to the field missions. Then it was considered that it could be better to consider the donation of equipment currently deployed in Afghanistan to certain potential member states, and we had a list of member states that we are not going to mention. This could be an option. However, whenever we talk about donation of equipment, we have to consider to approach this issue in parallel with the equipment, with the maintenance of this equipment. We cannot donate equipment if we don't have the provision to provide maintenance to this equipment. Otherwise, after 6 months, it will be a problem for the mission leadership. Then the point of having this equipment stored in Brindisi, we discussed this issue and we said it's not the most suitable solution, again, because of maintenance. If we store this equipment for 1 year, 2 years in Brindisi, and then it's not deployed, once this equipment is needed, probably this equipment is not serviceable anymore. So it's better to donate to the country, and the country can take care of the maintenance, and maybe the donor country, in this case, could provide the expertise for training the local, to develop the capacity of the country which is going to receive this equipment. Then we said that to better address these security challenges, it could be better to have a wider spectrum of police contributors, particularly FPUs. Because if we have countries with a small numbers of FPUs to be deployed, probably could be easier to have a better skilled personnel on the ground. Then we discussed about training. The training particularly is critical. If we put training connection with rapid deployment of unit, the focus should be on the pre-deployment training. And we mentioned that the police division and ITS just finalized a package of FPU training modules that has been shared with member states. So it's not an UN product, but is a product where all or most of the police countries gave their contribution. And in terms of training, it was highlighted the need to deliver the proper training also to the leadership of the missions, to make sure that they have, that the leadership as the full is aware about the potential of the equipment, the personnel that they have. It was mentioned that in some cases there was some equipment be given to the mission, and maybe the leadership was not fully aware about the potential capabilities of this. And in this regard, it was advised to provide this kind of training. And it was mentioned that the UN is also focusing in delivering a training for the mission leadership, but even at a bit lower level, at the component level, not only mission leadership, but also, I mean, for instance, the command staff of the unit. Then, regarding the rapid deployment, we mentioned the need of having. We said that this issue is strictly related of availability of standby unit, and this is just for your information, is something which is now in the strategic agenda just developed by the PKO and DFS, which consider among their priorities the rapid deployment, standby capabilities, and increase also the mobility of unit in theater. This could be also another issue that can help to meet rapid deploy capability. We also had a discussion regarding the shipment of the equipment to the field mission from the sending countries, and we just mentioned that, of course, there is the strategic airlift of FPUs is an important capability to enable the rapid deployment of the unit and their COE from the respective countries to the area of responsibility. But also it could be considered the self-deploy of the equipment done by the member state under a special agreement which is called Letter of Assist, LOA. This could be considered to expedite the deployment. Second? Okay, yes, okay. And then regarding the issue of addressing different security challenges, it was given emphasis to the need to have to make more use of specialized police teams. And in this regard, it was also mentioned the Security Council Resolution 2185, where it was where the PKO and police division was encouraged to make more use of these teams, particularly for capacity building. Finally, we talk about the role of female foreign police unit in addressing criminal issues. And it was said that, of course, female component inside the FPUs can be an added value, particularly addressing security issues in IDP camps, refugees camps. We made examples of the female Bangladesh FPUs in Haiti, as well as the one in the Indian deployed in Liberia. And I think, I don't know if I missed something, probably I missed some of your point. No? Okay, because I know that something was already discussed also with Michael. The last point that we consider in terms of rapid deployment was that it was also mentioned before regarding the standing police capacity can be considered as an added value because with the establishment of the standing police capacity, the police division has on one hand the capability to deploy in the short term a team of police officers to establish the headquarters in a new mission or to assist, as I mentioned before, the existing missions. So if we can have, for instance, SPC on one hand providing the command staff and maybe on the other hand more rapidly deployable foreign police unit, this could be a good point to address the issue of rapid deployment of unit. This is concluding my answer.
Thanks very much to all of the chairs for your reports. We've got not so many minutes for discussion. I thought that if you have a question or observation, we can make it maybe 30 seconds, I hope, and just kind of ID who you are and where you're addressing the question to. James Cookie?
To a law enforcement, There's a danger that once we call something a criminalized power structure that we reach for law enforcement responses, that we become path dependent. But these are power structures. So there may be forms of leverage available to UN peace operations that we haven't been thinking about. And I just wanted to touch on some of them. The key point we've been making throughout, or Mike's been making, is that this is about turning illicit economic power into political power. So there may be ways we can disrupt both, not just through law enforcement and military tools, but through other tools. And I heard the 30 seconds, so I'm just going to list them, and I'm sorry if they're not very self-explanatory. First, and we did touch on this in some of the comments, economic power, not just purchasing power, but economic regulatory power, particularly in development planning. There may be ways that the UN can actually change the opportunity structures out of which the illicit economy grows in the first place. Second, elections. Nobody's mentioned elections. They're a key site at which illicit economic power, through financing political actors, becomes political power. We could be bringing our analysis of criminal power structures into the UN's electoral assistance work, something we don't do at the moment. And third, strategic communications. The UN has increasingly powerful public information capacities and civilian affairs officers' capacities, which could be fighting the legitimacy of some of these criminal behaviors and even criminal groups in a more deliberate and strategic way. Finally, linking to DDR and SSR, nobody's mentioned the word amnesty, but one of the key problems for illicit actors is often that they are insecure and violent, therefore, because they can't secure their property, because their property exists in a criminal market by definition. There's some very interesting evidence from Colombia and other places that suggests that tax amnesty, allowing them to bring their ill-gotten gains into the legitimate economy, may be a way to transform them and co-opt them, reinforcing the support for the political process and taking the violence out of the equation. I realize that there will be that's a controversial point. I'm just trying to keep to more like 3 minutes. Sorry about that.
I think this is more of an observation. Jan and I are just from the National Intelligence University. I think this is more of an observation than anything else, but when we're looking at the economics of these power structures, I think it's important to keep in mind also that a lot of these power structures are basically propping up the entire country in some way, shape, or form. For example, you might be looking at a drug state or someplace like Guatemala, which is so inculcated now with the drug cartels that they are effectively the institutions that are governing there. or even in a place like Honduras where the drug traffickers are the ones that are building hospitals. So when we look at trying to address these economic issues and what criminalized element is there for it, we also have to consider what that's going to do to the entire economy, in some cases of a whole country. Is there really any way to win the drug war in Mexico at this point? Are the types of rhetorical questions that I have when we come to look at addressing criminal power structures. So maybe that's something to keep in mind also for the panel, what we're really looking at addressing here.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Next observation? Anyone?
I think in part I'd like to echo what James said. My name is Desmond Arias. I'm the Director of the Peace Operations Policy Program here at George Mason. I'd like to echo what James said and also react to what I just heard. In my experience, I think that sort of the path dependence of labeling things crime or looking at the problem as a war on drugs or a war on crime can almost always be, can often be counterproductive in resolving the underlying problems that are faced, right? When these problems are looked at in other contexts that I'm familiar with, it's very often useful to disaggregate the types of things that you want to repress, right? The types of things you want to stop. Is it high homicides? Is it certain conduct by state officials? Is it certain types of impunity? And address those specific acts as crime rather than thinking about having a war on organized crime or a war on drugs, and being very cautious about the language you adopt to avoid the type of path dependence that James was pointing out earlier. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, Jim.
Thank you, Jim Shear, Wilson Center and instrument of Bill Durch's. The surge FPU issue, I thought, is really very animated in our group. Two additional comments. Number one, in terms of the proposal for excess defense articles, from the U.S. national standpoint, there needs to be a certain transactional quality. I think for the U.S. Department of State to sell this to Capitol Hill, there needs to be a clear understanding that some countries will raise their hand and say, if we get the equipment, we're going to deploy. No one disagrees that FPUs are under-resourced and represent a gap in UN global capacity. But for it to work within the United States, there needs to be a certain understanding that positive things will happen if we go down this very complicated and difficult route. Secondly, and just to wrap up, criminal power structures get a vote here. If FPUs go into the mix with that more as a focal point of the mission, they have to assess how the power structures react to that, to complicate, complexify, and perhaps endanger their mission.
Thank you, Jim. Do we have another question, observation? Am I hearing it?
Sure. David Becker from National Defense University. When I was looking at all of these together as opposed to the individual working groups that we were in, it struck me that, again, something that we'd mentioned in ours seems to come up time and time again, which is, again, how do you measure success in these cases? And people probably can shake their heads and say, yeah, everybody asks the same question. But the issue here frequently comes up that as you look at particular organizations, they will measure success against those things that are most useful or make them look the best. And somehow or another, you have to be able to pull that together at a higher level and say, is that truly success, or are we in fact failing in at least one area, and we should be thinking about this in a larger picture. This comes back time and time again that frequently, as you make some of these reforms, you may in fact think that you're making progress, but in reality, you're not actually getting there.
Seriously shocked by that observation. We have time for one more observation before I turn the chair over to Ms. Hock. Lynn, do we have anybody on this side of the road? Going once, twice? Okay.
I've mentioned this to Mike already, but years ago I was one of the knuckleheads who deployed UN missions without having the full appreciation of this challenge to the political process and so on. And so As I read some of the material about people having their blinders on and so on and so forth, I figured, well, that was me. And the real challenge here is that no policymaker is interested in deploying a failed UN mission. My goal in working hard on these was to design and figure out what would make them successful. And we broke some china in doing that, but at any rate, we worked very hard to make them successful without having any kind of appreciation of what this criminalized power structure problem was. I mean, we talked a little bit about it going into Kosovo and so on, but we really didn't have a grasp of the real meaning and the long-term impact and the loss of resources that would go into not treating it properly. My recommendation is that we put together something for policymakers to help them understand this challenge a little better. You don't want to give them a book. I mean, maybe I'm thinking of something like a Frontline piece or a BBC production that's about 60 minutes long that talks to people like all of you in the room here who have been there and done that and experiences the challenge and talk about some of the lessons learned and how to approach the challenge. This is a real complex problem in so many dimensions, and I think there's an educational challenge here for policymakers about helping them understand, because believe me, this is not easy to understand, even if you're experienced in the kind of work of peacekeeping and stabilization.
Thank you very much. Certainly between that and the observation that Jim made that this is a reactive system that you all are dealing with and not something that sits still when you take action against it. Well, thank you very much. I'm not going to even try to summarize the presentations, A, because we don't have time, and B, it would be inadequate. But thank you all for joining in the day's participation, and I want to turn the floor over now to Mr. Mirahak, the Vice Chair of the UN High-Level Panel on Independent Panel on Peace Operations.
Thank you very much. And let me start, first of all, by thanking Mike very much on behalf of the panel. This has really been an invaluable day, and lots of good discussions that we can take back. And certainly, it was a Friends of Mike meeting. But I think it was very, very useful. I'd also like to thank Professor Desmond Arias. Thank you so much for the use of the facilities and being such a wonderful host. And thanks to James Cocaine and Bill Durch for chairing the sessions. Now, I know that a number of you were at the USIP meeting last Tuesday, but I feel perhaps for the benefit of those who weren't, that I might just spend a little bit of time just telling you where the panel is, what we have done so far, and where we intend to go, and then bring the discussion back to what we discussed today. So, as a number of you know, that 15 years on from the Brahimi report, the Secretary General felt, in terms of the change that has taken place, the environment that we find ourselves in the complex, mission theaters that we're being asked to operate, that the ground is completely changed, and it is time to take a look 15 years after that report in terms of what the future of peace operations are. And I emphasize peace operations because it's not just about the peacekeeping, but it's also about the peace, the mediation, the good offices, and other elements of the political mission. And as time has gone by, and in the 2.5 years that I have been at headquarters in my last job, we've seen the kind of incremental shifts that have taken place, which have made people reflect in terms of where are we vis-a-vis the charter, where are we with respect to sort of the doctrine, And these incremental shifts in language of the mandates, whether it's the Force Intervention Brigade in DRC or the robust mandate in Mali, where is this taking us? And it's just not the reflection of the Secretariat, or it's just not the reflection of the Security Council, but it is many other stakeholders, not the least of the troop contributing countries and the police contributing countries who are in theater, who feel the need to be discussed, who are feeling to a certain extent marginalized, knowing that their troops are on the ground and that they are within their participation in a mission, the mandates of the mission are changing. So I think to bring together all of the various facets of stakeholder needs, again, was an important part of what we needed to do. So given all of this, the question that I think that Mike said this morning, the key question is, are we fit for purpose? You know, where are we going? You know, what are we expected to do? Do we have the wherewithal? You know, a lot of what you discussed today, you know, goes into those elements. Most of the missions now, over, I would say, the past few years, have had protection of civilians as kind of the predominant element of the missions. Protection of civilians, and I know that there was a colleague here who was just discussing with the C-34. The C-34 is the partnership arrangement that we have with members of the General Assembly that is supposed to look at the policy related to peacekeeping operations. And they look at it, you know, in a very different way, because they're looking at where is the element of sovereignty under this overall guise of protection of civilians? And are we using protection of civilians in effect to encroach on some elements of sovereignty? So, but again, some of the things that we've discussed today link directly, impact directly on the protection of civilians, whether it's you know, economic rights in terms of what is required, and that what the international donor community is providing in ODA is not getting to the people who need it most because of, you know, corruption and other means of, you know, criminalized power structures that are diverting this from the intended use of the funds. The other issue that we're talking about is, given what we're doing now, are we in peacekeeping? Are these peacekeeping missions, or have we moved into peace enforcement missions, or you know, some other form? But I know we had a couple of people, maybe they were last night or even at lunch, who were saying, well, I was in the mission, and describing really a peace agreement and really kind of monitoring or implementing, I think, you know, either a ceasefire agreement. I know that we talked about colleagues who used to work in the disengagement forces in Golan, and we always teased them because we felt that, you know, they were going into what we called sort of a beach chair mission, because they sat there in the beautiful sun, but, you know, it changed completely, and they are in absolutely the direct line of fire right now. So I think the changing definitions of where we are and whether this is, you know, so some of the fundamentals is are we still in peacekeeping, or have, you know, where are we going? Last week, when we had discussions with the authorities here in Washington, we were reminded very carefully and repeatedly about the budget. And you know, about the sort of the zero growth budget, and that budget now is $9.2 billion. But again, if we look at what the expectations are, and if we have an assessment of where the global situation is, clearly it's very difficult, I think, to think of it in a zero growth budget. Lastly, I think on the increasing role that regional organizations are playing, and that didn't come up in most of our discussions, but particularly in Africa and with the African Union and where the bulk of our missions are, the role of regional organizations is something that we need to look at also as part of Chapter 8 in the Charter. So that's where we are, I think I would say, in an entire menu of the kinds of things that we're looking at. The process that we've engaged in is really to try and listen up to now to as large a group of stakeholders as we've been able to fit into our program. This has involved regional consultations in Dhaka, Bangladesh, in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, in Brussels, in Europe, Cairo for the Middle East, and what is remaining for us is Brazil in Latin America. And in each one of these regional consultations, not only have we spoken with the host government and the regional countries who all assembled, but we have also spoken to troop contributing countries. We've spoken to civil society organizations, women's groups, academia, think tanks. So really as large an audience as we were able to fit into those consultations. As I said, we have one more consultation to do. Our aim right now is to start arriving at the outlines of what our report will be. The report is to be submitted to the Secretary General by the 23rd, 25th, or maybe the end of May. The Secretary General will then review the report. As you know, the Secretary General then submits the report with a letter to the General Assembly. The intention is that report will be discussed in September in the General Assembly. So we are, at this point, have not formulated any of our recommendations. As I said, we've been in listening mode, but we are now in a stage where we're gathering all that we have heard and trying to formulate that. So with that, let me just turn very quickly to some of what, the richness of the discussion today and how it fits in. And I think the way we look at it is that this whole business with criminalized, power structures is absolutely replete with dilemmas, which we need to factor in. On the one hand, what do we do? And in our group, we talked about, for instance, the short-term results. What can we do in the short term? What is happening that we need? Versus what is the end state in terms of the long-term sustainability? So one can't go without the other, and you've got to be very careful about what you choose in the short term, but at the same time recognizing that the long-term sustainability of it. How do we maintain political partnership? And this goes very much to the point that you made with eliminating the spoilers who may very well be those partners that we're negotiating with. And that's what we find ourselves confronted with in many countries, and we've discussed those countries. Then we look at what are intended, how do we manage both the intended and the unintended consequences of that. So do we create a power vacuum that may arise? So how do we manage that part of it? And then given the difficulty of the work itself that many of you have experienced firsthand, how do we prioritize limited resources? What is it that we're going to do, and particularly in light of the budget issues and other things that I just mentioned? Secondly, how do we tackle the issue in more, I would say, low leverage or lower authority environments? Because I think, Mike, particularly the examples that we're looking at is a generation of peace missions that have passed. It's, we're looking at the Timor, Eastern Slovenia, Kosovo, where we had transitional administrations. we've talked about the extraordinary powers that the High Representative had in Bosnia. Do you think we would get those same kinds of missions and authorities and power today? Doubtful, highly doubtful. And so, again, we have to factor that in. So we don't have the same leverage. We probably wouldn't have, the same levels of authority, and yet these require that, the sort of the teeth and the muscle. So I think we need to look at that. And much of what we discussed today can, and we have to discuss that which of the tools that we discussed today can still work when we don't have that kind of authority, power, or leverage. And then I think the question is who can help build that leverage for the UN and how in the peace missions. How, is it part of the mandate? Is it part of the strength of the assessment? What is going to give that kind of leverage? Again, in that relating to the budget, in a low resource environment, yes, we can look at some of things like you were talking about equipment and other things that can come from member states. But again, we have the low resource is not only the actual budget and the funds, but also very limited time and sort of a limited political bandwidth. So again, this means that very difficult decisions need to be made with respect to prioritization and also with sequencing. So then the question is, which tools are the highest value? And that's the discussion that needs to be taken place for the limited investment that we can make. And again, as I said, how should we prioritize and sequence that? And then in the discussions that we've had is, again, how do we limit harm or do no harm to others as we take on some of these difficult issues, particularly with criminalized power structures. So, I think that's sort of, in general, the way I would sort of reflect on where we are today. But the last point that I want to make is a sense of the expectations that are out there. And I know that many times when people were talking, they looked directly at me in terms of, what the panel is probably going to recommend, but what the UN can take on. And I think we need to I think, level that, the expectations of what what a peace operation in and of itself can do. And in the end, I think it is a partnership of the international community. And I would say people like, Michael Hartmann and others who are working right in the thick of it in Afghanistan can well understand that. So let me leave you then with the final thought that it is ultimately, and what Mike said this morning, it is ultimately that are we going to be able to deliver to that little 3-year-old girl in South Sudan, because I think expectations are high, but it is those innocent expectations that brought us all together and that continue to bring us all together and that we need to work towards. So thank you very much.
Mike, are you wrapping up?
I hadn't actually thought about doing this. Mira and Paul, thank you ever so much for being here and lending your expertise. And thank you for your very sober comments about expectations. A lot to think about. And I look forward to, getting your thoughts on what I should focus my work on. It would be most useful for your effort. And of course, all of you have, it's just amazing the expertise that you brought to bear and the ideas that were flowing forth. I was furious, my battery ran dead. I was furiously making notes. It's like when you had to fill out blue books, getting a cramp in my hand. It was really a very rich discussion. So I look forward to crystallizing this and getting it into our conclusions, and especially with regard to some of the policy community that I met today, following up with you where there are fertile ideas that we can pursue and get into action. And I think, some of these actions are actions that the United States can take to support what you're seeking to do for that 3-year-old girl. That's why we all came together, and I hope we stay together in support of what you're trying to accomplish. So let's a round of applause for the panel, please.